Hello, everyone. Welcome back to I See What You're Saying, the Disciplined Listening Podcast. I'm Michael Reddington, and today it is my pleasure to introduce our next guest, Bill Scheidt. Bill's story reached straight out of a movie script. He goes to West Africa to study giraffes in the wild. While he's there, he ends up falling in love with the people, the culture, and the music of West Africa. So he makes multiple return trips, staying longer and longer each time. Along the way, he learns to speak Swahili and becomes an English teacher teaching children in West Africa. While he's there, like any good movie, he ends up meeting a legendary mentor who teaches him all he knew about West African drumming. Bill, being a musician from a musician family, soaks it all up, takes everything he learned from that experience, brings it home to the United States, and founds Sewa Beats. Bill and his team at Sewa Beats use West African drumming as a metaphor, as a teaching tool, as they work with organizations to teach leadership communication, culture, corporate culture, and diversity and inclusion training programs. They've trained over 300,000 participants, and they demonstrate time and time again how music is not just a perfect metaphor, but a great learning tool for, in this case, professionals, their typical clients, to learn how to communicate better, how to recognize others better, and how to fall into rhythm with people that they otherwise might not have thought possible. They do amazing work. I've seen them in action. They show up with a truck full of drums. They do a great job. I'm so excited to bring this conversation to you today as we all listen to Bill share his entire experience, the work that he does with his clients now, everything that he learned in Africa, drumming and beyond, and how he brings it all together. It's a fantastic conversation. I'm so excited to share it with everybody. But before we do, we have to thank our sponsors that make it possible. First, we have HumanTell. Please head over to humantell.com and check out all of the online training they have available for recognizing when people's behavior, specifically emotions, are changing. We can gain a significant strategic advantage in our conversations. It helps us build better rapport, demonstrate empathy, connect with people faster when we understand how their emotions are shifting in real time and what that likely means somebody's thinking and experiencing. I've completed this training myself. I highly recommend it. Please head over to humantell.com. And once you found the programs that are best for you, enter the code INQUASIVE25 for 25% off all of their online training. Also want to thank the International Association of Interviewers. Please check out certifiedinterviewer.com. In there, you can explore all of the opportunities that IAI provides for learning, both in person and online, for networking, for legal and additional resources to support investigators at all levels of their career. And while you're there, please check out the Certified Forensic Interviewer designation to see if that designation is right for you or your team at this point in your career. And Inquasive. Organizations search us out so we can teach their leadership, sales, and HR teams how to encourage people to share sensitive information under vulnerable circumstances in the face of consequences. For those of you that might have any interest in learning more about the programs that we offer to organizations around the world, please check us out at inquasive.com, INQUASIVE.com. So now, without further ado, thank you so much for joining us one more time. We appreciate you sharing your time with us today. Here is Bill Scheidt. Bill, good afternoon. It is great to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome, man. Me too. And I was telling you before we hit the record button on this thing, I've been looking forward to this conversation since I first launched the podcast. When we did this, and people who have listened know, really one of my goals were to get as many unique perspectives on communication as I can in one place so people can learn and integrate and find insight in what works for them. And although you and I really we've met before, but really only in passing. This is going to be the first real conversation we've ever had together. But yes, just knowing the little bit that I do about what you do, I'm completely fascinated, and I've seen it in action. So can you please share with the group, to any level of detail that you want, what you do with Sewa Beats?
Yeah, sure. I'll start high level and then we can go from there. So what we do is programming in the organizational development world, in the corporate world specifically, in which we use music for experiential learning and for training and development. And specifically, the music that we use is West African drumming. So we put a drum in the hands of every attendee at an event. So picture an annual meeting, a leadership retreat, a training on communication, leadership, DEI, you name it. We give everybody a drum. We have a lead facilitator and a group of musicians on stage. We teach the participants how to play music, and we debrief each step along the way, and we draw connections between the musical experience and what they do every day on the job as professionals. So you can think of it as experiential learning in the sense that it's not learning about topics like communication, topics like leadership, topics like DEI. It's not learning about, but it's having an experience of. So we use music to create an experience of communication, of leadership, et cetera, and then connect that back and make it relevant to what people are doing in their role in their organization.
Which is super cool. And I think it was an HR conference, and I would never remember what year it was. We're probably going back at least 6 or 7 years at this point. But I remember showing up and walking to where I was going to be speaking and literally being like, wait a minute, what? And looking back into one of the other rooms as you and one of your guys were setting up all of these drums and being like, wait a minute, what is going on in here?
Yes.
And we've crossed paths at different events several times since then. So I've seen it, I've heard it. I think it's really cool. And I'm super, super excited to talk about using music as an educational tool, as an experiential tool. I'm sure you know more about me with what it does with our brains and what it does with our expression. And I'm completely fascinated by it. Music plays a huge role in my life. I can't play an instrument to save my life, but consuming music has played a huge role in my life. And honestly, my ability to survive in the world since I was a young kid, it's sort of just been how I relate to everything around me.
Yes.
So I'm really excited about this. Now, I don't know a whole lot about your background, but am I correct that your journey into West African drumming started with hanging out with giraffes?
Correct. That's right. Yeah. So in undergrad, I started off studying biology. I was going to be pre-med. And then I decided I wanted to spend more time outside than I did in a doctor's office. And I switched my focus to wildlife biology. And my first trip to Africa was in Tanzania in East Africa. And I went there specifically to study the wildlife. But that first trip, I was really fortunate because it had a very strong cultural component to it. So I learned to speak Swahili. I stayed with families in rural villages, and I really got the ability to navigate through that place in that culture. And so I wanted to go back. I wrote a grant to study a population of giraffe. I got funded. I went back. It was a dream job. My job was to hike through the national park where I was living. I was living in the national park. So go hiking every day and take photos of giraffes. And it turns out that giraffe have very unique patterns on their neck. And if you take enough photos of a population over time, you can identify the individuals. You can tell who's male, who's female, how old are they. You get a sense of the whole demographics of the population. And that is when I first saw African drums in their native or traditional role. And I saw what a powerful connector the instrument and the music is in the fabric of communities there. And I was just completely blown away by that. And that started the U-turn from wildlife biology into music.
That's awesome. And I'm jealous again. I never made it out of Dar es Salaam, that my trip to Tanzania. So I would have killed to have that experience someday. It's on my bucket list to take my family and go back someday. And I am listening to that going, wow, that's really awesome. You're hiking around, taking pictures. Wait a minute. Aren't there like lions and stuff around there too?
Yeah.
You're hiking around.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I had an armed escort. So it was me and a ranger with a rifle hiking through the bush. We got charged by elephants. We unknowingly hiked past a lion one day. I almost stepped on a poisonous snake. He grabbed me and threw me on the ground. And I said, hey, what the heck do you do that for? And he said, well, look where you were just stepping. So yeah, it was you realize quickly that you are not the top of the food chain in that environment, and that makes a difference.
I'm substantially less jealous than I was when you started the story. But I'm fascinated to learn a little bit more about your first experience that you had when you were introduced to the African drumming actually in person when you were there. Were you like invited to somebody's house? Was there a celebration going on? Like how were you introduced to this the first time?
Okay, that's a great question. So the first time I saw drumming in Africa, I was actually at the home of a former Black Panther leader who was living in exile in Tanzania. And I went there to visit him, to learn about his history, learn about the awesome work he's doing in the community over there, doing tons of community outreach stuff. And he had a group of local drummers come perform at his place for me and a few of the other people who were there to kind of give us a sense of what the music and the local culture was like. And that was the first time that I saw African musicians playing African drums. You know, I had seen African drums here in the States before, kind of, you know, drum circle style stuff or mixed in with Western, you know, pop bands and such. But to see it in that setting, that was the first time that I had really seen it in that traditional role, if you will.
That's very cool. Now, did you have a musical background?
I did, yeah. So growing up, my folks started me on violin when I was 5. Then I played alto sax through middle school. In high school, I decided I was too cool for music, so I did sports instead. And then in college, I learned to play the bass guitar. I learned to play the harmonica, and then from there, got into percussion. And it turns out that, in fact, the history of music goes back even further in my family. It turns out that my grandmother's father was actually a drummer in the Italian army before he emigrated to the US.
Wow.
So, and I didn't learn that until well after I was into my drumming career.
No kidding. So like, it
Yes.
starts to come full circle at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So I could spend all day asking you questions about these stories because they sound super fascinating in and of themselves. But to try to work our way back to the lessons that you teach people all the time, I'm
Yes.
assuming after you had that experience where you saw the drums for the first time, that lit the fire to experience it more.
You got
So
it.
did that lead you down the path of seeking teachers or mentors to learn how to play them?
Yes. Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I continued to go back to Africa, and I was doing several different things. I was doing community outreach work. I volunteered to teach English in a rural school. I was teaching computer skills to women and mothers who wanted to improve their employability. And then on the side, I was studying music. So I made several trips to East Africa, and then I met my teacher from West Africa, a man named Mamady Keita. He's from Guinea, West Africa. And then I started to go to West Africa, and that's where I started to study the music that we currently share through our programs at Sewa Beats.
Awesome. Just curious, how many trips have you made to Africa?
6 trips so far, and I've spent a total of about a year and a half
Wow.
living and working and studying there.
Wow. And 6 is a good number because that's not an easy place to get to. It's not a cheap place to get to, the visa
Yes.
process and all those other things. So that's
Yeah.
a pretty substantial amount of time that you've spent over there.
Yep.
I'm going to detour away from the music for a little bit.
Sure.
You worked as a teacher in Africa.
Yes.
I'm curious, as you were teaching English to non-native English speakers,
Mhm.
what did that teach you about listening and communication?
Oh, I mean, that was a huge lesson because, you know, at that time I didn't have much of a teaching background. And so I hit all kinds of expert blind spots. You know, you and I speak English all day, every day, and we forget how much we know that we know. And so it was a learning for me because I found that teaching others to speak English became more of a listening exercise for me than it did a speaking exercise because I had to meet the students where they were, navigate around my blind spots, figure out what is it that I know that I'm forgetting that I know that I need to communicate here. And the only way I know that is by listening to the feedback that I'm getting from the students. So it was a really powerful experience in the importance of listening in the world of communication.
That's a phenomenal example because generally speaking, people who are technical experts often have the most difficult time listening because we feel like we know the answers, we have the experience, this is common sense to us. And to your point, some of the details kind of fade in and out. We just do it automatically, we don't think about it.
Yes.
So a native English speaker might not think of ourselves as a technical expert, but and I guess people who listen to me might be like, dude, you're not an expert in speaking. We hear this stuff all the time. But because we speak English every day, all day, being a technical expert in that and having to stop and say, wait a minute, how do I teach this in a way where somebody else can understand it?
Yes.
Prioritizing the listening and meeting the students where they had to be, fantastic adjustment, which I'm sure wasn't easy and probably took a little bit of time. Were there any particular mechanisms that you had or techniques that you used to try to check your comfort level or your expertise and really open yourself up to what somebody else might need or what they might be missing?
Yeah, I think it was really an exercise in humility. So instead of asking myself, what do I know that I want to communicate, it's what would be of service to them that I can give in the spirit of helpfulness. So instead of the sage on the stage, it's the guide on the side. So not making it about me as the teacher, but making it about them as the student and what would serve them. So I think that was one of the key lessons or key takeaways that helped me shift mindset in that moment.
That's enormous, man. And so many people don't get to that for whatever. It's really unnatural. It's a total change of perspective. But and I'm going to be biased here, of course. I truly believe that a great listener, a great communicator is more focused on creating the experience the other person needs
Yes.
as opposed to being focused on what they want to feel, say, or do. And it's really hard to get there. And I feel like you have to be immersed in situations where you really don't have a choice to be successful before people really begin to embrace the power of that.
There is so much power in that. I think that's really a radically transformative concept that if we adopted that on a grand scale, culturally speaking, I think it would transform so many aspects of our society, of our experience of each other as human beings.
Oh, dude, we could go off on 2 hours on that alone. I'm
Yeah,
in
for sure.
complete agreement there.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how many students you worked with. I'm sure varying levels of age and background, and like with teaching anybody anything, performance and capability and those things over multiple trips. I have no doubt. You said been there for about a year, so who knows how many days you've been actually interacting. So this might be a bit of an unfair question. But are there any particular experiences you remember with students where you had that aha moment where something they said or did improved how you taught or connected with students from there forward?
Oh man, that's a great question. I would say one of the takeaways for me, or two I can think of, was number one, the enormous amount of respect that students in that particular African culture show to their teachers. And on your website, I'm going to read this because I think it's a great quote. You say, people interpret how we communicate with them as proof of how much we respect them. And so I think the enormous respect that the students have just in general for teachers was eye-opening for me. And I think that when I saw that at first, that was one of those key moments that helped define the context of our entire communication, was how important that value of respect is. And what a connection there is between communication and respect. So I'm not sure if that really hits the nail on the head, but that was a very eye-opening experience for me. It's so much different than how we relate to teachers, or the student-teacher relationship here is in the United States. And I had never seen a classroom that was that quiet, that respectful. When you ask a question, the students raise their hand, you call on them. They don't just say the answer, they stand up, they say the answer, and they remain standing until you say, you can sit down.
Wow.
so that level of respect was what I was just really, really blown away. And the way that reframes the communication between a teacher and a student is just amazing. And so I found that my job was, how do I reciprocate that respect? How do I show that same respect back? So it's not just student to teacher, but it's teacher to student, which I think reinforces that whole dynamic of two-way communication that I was really trying to bring into my teaching at that time. How do I give what's needed instead of say what I think they need?
I love it. And at that point, it's, yes, there's the student teacher dynamic, but it becomes a bit more of a peer-to-peer interaction. Like, we're two people who are involved in trying to achieve the same thing. We just have different roles in how we achieve it.
That's it. And that's one of the great connections to music. If you have two or more musicians on stage with different instruments, we're peers, but we're playing different instruments, and we still have to align. We're still playing the same piece of music. We're still trying to create something together.
Fantastic. And we're going to come back to the music because I am fascinated. But I was going to say one more question. It's probably one more group of questions before we get back to the music. You learned to speak Swahili.
I did.
I think that's my wife studied Swahili when she was in college because she thought she was going to do like Peace Corps type work, probably not with the Peace Corps, but that type of work. So she started. I still have Swahili books on my bookshelf upstairs that we unpacked from hers. And I think does Rafiki mean friend?
It does.
Okay. So now I probably should have learned that from a Disney movie.
Yes.
So when I was in Dar es Salaam, one of my clients took me to the casino there late one night, and we ended up being there really late, and we got separated. And as I was walking around trying to find him, because I really wasn't in condition to be on my own at that point, I kept walking by the same security guy. And he kept smiling and saying Rafiki and fist bumping me. And it got to the point where I'm like, is he messing with me? Like, what's going on? So when I finally got back to my buddy who spoke Swahili, I'm like, yo, you got to straighten me out on this. And he started laughing. He's like, no, he's calling you friend. He's really cool. Come on back. And so that was my so I think Jumbo, Rafiki, and there were two or three other words that I knew that now I'm trying to remember. But that's, nobody cares about me. So I'm very curious, learning a new language, especially as an adult. And it's not that Swahili comes from the same roots that English does.
Right.
What did learning how to speak Swahili teach you about listening and communication?
What did it teach me about listening and communication? That's a great question. I think what I really like about learning languages in general is I think language helps define worldview. And if you can understand someone's language, it gives you an insight, a little bit of insight into what their worldview is. And I think Swahili is a good example. There's a word in Swahili that doesn't have a direct literal translation, and the word is pole. And it means something along the lines of, I hear you, I understand, an expression of empathy, an expression of sympathy. And people use it a lot. So if you and I met on the street and you told me, oh man, I really had a tough day, something happened, blah, blah, blah. Instead of saying, yeah, I feel you, or oh, I'm sorry to hear that, pole. And people use that word all the time. And so when we see, like for me, what I got out of that is, okay, here's this word that is an expression of empathy, an expression of listening, of sympathy, of connection. And then I look at the rest of the society and I see, oh, in this culture, family is so important, friends are so important, community is so important, connection is so important. And we see that expressed just in this one word. So for me, what I really love about language is it does help us understand each other. It builds that human connection because it gives us a sense of what is the worldview of the person that we're speaking with.
I love that. That's a fantastic example. And that was not one of the words that I came across in the brief time that I was there. When you were learning the language, I'm sure some of it was studying and recall and application and those kinds of things, but especially being there, I'm sure that you were immersed in it because everyone around you was speaking it. So trying to pick up on what people were saying and then trying to use it and pick up on their reactions.
Yes.
So in that process of being immersed in learning the language, How accelerated did you find your ability to evaluate nonverbal communication and contextual awareness became?
Oh man. Well, yeah, that's a great question. So the nonverbal cues that we use here in the States, many of them don't translate in Swahili or in Tanzania. I remember one day the younger brother of the family that I was staying with came to get me from Swahili lessons to walk back to through the village to the house where we were staying, and I wasn't quite finished yet, and I saw him looking at me, and so I put my one finger in the air like, "Hey, 1 minute, I'll be right there," and I just got a completely blank stare from him, and I was like, "Oh right, that doesn't mean anything here, does it?" And if another great nonverbal example is looking people directly in the eye. In America, when we speak to each other, that's a sign of respect. It's a sign of connection. In Tanzania, when you look someone directly in the eye, it's a sign of either aggressive intent or sexual intent. So when you're speaking with someone, you look them in the eye for a quick second, and then you look away and you continue to speak. And maybe a few seconds later, then you make a quick eye contact, and then you look away and you continue to speak. So I had a very difficult time adjusting when I got to Tanzania, and an even harder time when I got back to the States adjusting here. I really had to remember, no, you're supposed to look people in the eye here. And when this guy's looking me in the eye, it doesn't mean he wants to fight, and he's not trying to pick me up and take me home. It's a different communication non-verbally.
Yeah, that transition must have been huge, especially because you spent so much time there. So it's not like you went for a week, just figured it out and came home. I mean, you were living there. It's what you were doing every single day.
Yes. Yeah. So it was a very interesting learning. And going back to your question, the immersion, I think, made me learn much faster, because just to communicate the simple things, food, bathroom, water, that kind of stuff, I couldn't, sometimes if you go to a country, you can get away with speaking a little of the language and filling in with English, because maybe some people, no, in the rural villages in Tanzania, there's no English, at least at that time in that location. It was all Swahili. So I had to learn as a matter of practical daily survival.
And motivation is the mother of invention, right? I will figure this out. I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. I don't want to die. I will figure this out.
We're going to say motivation is the mother of communication in this context.
I like that. I like where you're going, man. So with that immersion in that experience, I know you said that there were things that you had to kind of get into and then get out of as you were in that environment and then transitioning back. But I'm sure that there are observation or communication habits that you picked up learning a language and communicating in a new place that you still use even back here because of that universal application. So how did you evolve as a communicator, learning to speak a completely strange language in a completely strange land?
So I think the biggest lesson for me was the shift between listening to respond versus listening to comprehend.
Ooh.
So I think here in the States, prior to that experience, when someone was talking, I was already thinking of what I was going to say. Mm-hmm. So I'm not worried about do I understand them? Because on the surface, like you said before, my brain says, I already know what they're going to say. At least I'm an expert in the language. And because I understand the content, maybe I'm not so focused on the context. I'm hearing the words, but am I really getting the meaning? Maybe not if I'm just listening to respond, because I'm already thinking about what I'm going to say. I'm not so focused on really comprehending. Versus, am I listening to comprehend? Because I'm not so familiar with the content, the actual vocabulary. I have to really make sure I'm tracking the context and understanding the meaning and listening to comprehend first. And then, okay, once I have the comprehension, now, is there a response? What's the appropriate response, et cetera? But I think that is a subtle shift that makes a huge, huge difference.
It does make a huge difference. And I don't know that it's that subtle, because we do get into our routines. Like this happened to me the other day. I was going to run an errand and I drove right by where I needed to turn because I was going the direction that I would take my son to school every morning. So my brain is on autopilot and I got to go like a quarter of a mile before damn it. And I turn around and head back the other way. So if you think about all the conversations we have and how familiar we are with most people and most topics and most scenarios we find ourselves in, That's what happens. Our brains cut ahead. We focus on something else. We're jumping in. So we don't have to worry about the context. It helps if we do, but most of the time we can survive. We've gotten this far without. So to have to condition ourselves to operate differently, that I don't even think that's that subtle a shift. I think that's a really big shift. What was awesome for you was you didn't have a choice. You had to do it. Like, I have no idea what's going on here.
Yeah.
But then being able to carry that back to your native environment is super powerful.
Well, and I think that's one of the connections that I like to share with people in our communications programs. You know, what we're talking about here is the fact that it's the difference between how fast we speak and how fast we think. There's some research in the Harvard Business Review that says we speak at approximately 125 words per minute on average here in the US, if you average out all the fast talkers and slow talkers. But we have 13 billion neurons in our brain. That's a tremendous amount of computational power. So while you're communicating to me at 125 words a minute, my 13 billion neurons are already, and I'm already off in the future and no longer listening to what you're actually saying.
Yeah. I love it when I'm talking to somebody and I hear them say, well, just be present. Like, okay. Like, that sounds great when you say it, and conceptually I get it, but if we don't put a process to that, if we don't have an outcome tied in the motivation to stay present, it's never going to happen. So I always chuckle when I'm like you, I'm at an event, I'm listening to another speaker, or there's another conversation and they're talking about being present, but all they say is be present. That's like saying, just breathe. Like, just breathe. Like, there's a process that goes along that makes that happen. That's really, really important.
Indeed. I couldn't agree with you more. And what I think is really a fascinating connection is we get kind of the same summary, but very limited instructions when it comes to listening, right? Like, as a kid, people say, you know, listen up, pay attention, open your ears. And that's about the most instruction. I mean, in the educational system, when I went through it, that's kind of what I got. But I think that communication, very much like music, it's an acquired ability. So we have to practice it, and it's made of composite sub-skills. So it's just like music, composite sub-skills. So we have to understand rhythm, we have to understand melody, we have to understand harmony, we have to understand the technical ability on our instrument. And it's an acquired ability because we have to practice all those things. And I think communication is exactly the same thing. And I think mindfulness is one of those specific composite skills. Mindfulness is, I think, one of the keys to communication, because, like you said, we can't just tell people, well, shut up and listen, or just be present. We actually have to train that presence. We have to train that mindfulness. And I think that's one of the powerful things about music, because music forces us to be present. And what I like about my line of work is we always joke around that, you know, the drums don't lie. If we have a room full of 200 drums, 500 drums, 1,200 drums, if people are present and aligned and connected, you hear that in the music right away. And if it's not, everybody else in the conference room, in the conference building, in that block of the city is going to hear that too, because it's instantly, it's almost like retro technology for mindfulness and communication. Like, you're going to get some pretty instant feedback on that.
Yeah, I love it. Instant and audible feedback. You know right now whether this is working or not.
Right.
That's a perfect segue. Let's kick back to music, because I really am fascinated about this. And, you know, this is all about me, right? Why wouldn't it be? I think one of the cool synergies that we have, although different in our own ways, is I was immersed in interrogation and thought, wait a minute, there's a much wider application for what I'm learning. Let's take this into business, family conversations. Let's go. Yep. You were immersed in music, and at some point had to think, wait a minute, there's a much wider application for what I'm doing right now. What was that aha moment or series of aha moments for you that took you from this West African drumming is awesome? Oh, wait, we can teach a lot of really cool stuff with this.
That's such a fantastic question. I have to give the credit to that insight to my teacher from West Africa, Mamady Keita. He lived his life musically. And when I say he lived his life musically, you know, he was a master musician. Some people say he's the greatest musician of his instrument who ever walked the face of the earth. When he was 19, He went to Algeria for the Pan-Africa Games and won the gold medal for the best drummer in Africa at the age of 19. And in my opinion, if you're the best drummer in Africa, you're pretty high up there in the best drummer in the world. But when I watched how he lived his life, how he communicated with people, he lived his life as if he were playing music with the same principles that he played music. He applied those same principles to his life. But he rarely spoke about that. You know, I would ask him in private moments here and there about it, and he would say, yeah, that's pretty much, you know, that's what I do. That's what I'm doing. And I would just watch him do it over and over and over again. And that's where I really started to understand, okay, so if we can take music and translate it to our lives outside of just that moment when we're actually playing music, then the sky's the limit. Let's experiment. Let's see what areas we can connect this to. And areas like communication, areas like leadership, areas like diversity, like change management, you know, there's so many direct connections between how we navigate those elements of life and how we play music. You know, the metaphor of music is just so rich and so powerful.
Agree. Somebody who can't play an instrument, I completely agree. I'm listening to you give off the composite skills of being a musician. I'm like, nope. And definitely now I know why I can't play music. There it is.
Yeah.
But I do believe, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, you know, to that point, that's one of the things that we say to participants. You know, we say, look, we're going to challenge you to learn to play a piece of music. You got 60 minutes to do it. And yes, you're not professional musicians, but you are professionals. And the same skills that make you successful as a professional are the same skills that are going to make you successful in this musical environment. So what's success about? It's about the way that we connect to each other. It's the chemistry that we have as a team. It's about the way we relate to our audiences. It's about our ability to lead. It's about our ability to follow. It's about our ability to harmonize diverse skill sets, diverse perspectives, diverse backgrounds. It's about our ability to be agile, our ability to pivot, to adapt to change. So, you know, all of these skills that we can apply in so many areas of our life. And what we encourage people to do is just for a second, suspend your disbelief about your own musical inability and focus on what you know how to do in your life as a professional, as a human being, and bring those skills to the musical world. So we say, in the same way we have the expression, it's not what you say, but it's
how you say it.
How you say it. It's not what we play, but it's how we play it. So we use music as an opportunity to embody all of these communication principles, all of these leadership principles, et cetera, et cetera.
That's awesome. So new question. Forget what I was going to ask before.
Okay.
Talked earlier about music, the musical metaphor being so rich and so deep. I imagine that's a bottomless pit. You know, we could dive into that for a long time. And I love the way that you just described that. So when you look across the different programs that you teach, what are some of your favorite musical metaphors that you use to apply what you do to help people develop business and communication skills?
Oh, that's great. So I think one of my favorite ones is in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So the musical metaphor in diversity. So does every instrument in an ensemble sound the same? No. Do we even want it to sound the same? No. It's those differences that actually make the music sound rich. So in the context of diversity, it's about valuing our differences and finding a way to harmonize those differences so that it creates a piece of music that sounds good for everyone. Or, for example, inclusion. Is the spotlight always and all the time on one instrument or one musician, or are we creating an environment where everyone has the opportunity to make their contribution in a way that it's respected and heard? Or let's say equity. So does a drum set sound as loud as a flute? No. So we got to take that into account when we're mixing the mics, because a balanced and equitable mix makes the music sound good for everybody, the drummer and the flute player. So, and you know, we could go 2 hours into the leadership connections, the communication connections, all of that.
Well, give me a couple. I'll try not. I mean, you could rope this into a 2-hour, 2-part conversation. I mean, that may or may not still happen. Time will tell. But what are like maybe your top 1 or 2 leadership or communication metaphors as well?
Yeah, sure. So, for example, leadership. We just did a program yesterday for a big bank, and it was their top 150 executive leaders. Now, we're talking about a very buttoned up crowd, and you could see the looks on their faces as they walked into the room. Well, what does playing music have anything to do with me running this huge bank? And at the end, when we debriefed, there was 3 or 4 of those executives that stood up and said, the connection to me is communication. And they shared insights like communication is a two-way street. Like they got it, that it wasn't just us on the stage telling them what to do and how to play, but it was their music feeding back to us, and it became a collective. So the example there is not leading from hierarchy, but leading from influence. And not just communication one way, me telling you what to do, but communication as a two-way street, communication based on listening. And that was another takeaway. One of the other executives said, yeah, I got it, that communication is not just how you speak, but it's how you listen. So we talk a lot about playing from listening. So I'm not thinking about what I'm going to play. I'm listening to the music around me and I'm responding to that. So my playing is sourced by my listening. So it's not talking for talking's sake. It's speaking out of a response to what I'm hearing, but hearing first, listening first. So those are some of the connections there.
I love it. All great examples. I'm going to make an assumption. I feel like it's a pretty solid limb to walk out on. I imagine that it's not infrequent that one of the takeaways from the group is a person who nobody expected to do a great job musically magically appears as the drumming superstar in the room. Like, wait a minute, where did that come from? Does that happen pretty commonly?
It does. And the opposite also happens. And sometimes it's actually the opposite that makes for such a powerful learning moment. I'm thinking of a group we did. It was a small leadership retreat. So 20 very high level folks in this international organization. And in a group of 20, if you're the one person who's not getting it, you can't hide. In a room of 100, 200, 500, okay, fine, you're fine, whatever. And this executive, she wasn't getting it. She wasn't getting it. She wasn't getting it. And her response was absolutely brilliant. She put her drum down. She set her hands on the drum so she could feel the vibration of the music through the skin because the skin was vibrating, and she listened. And I stopped the whole process. And I said, first of all, I want to acknowledge you because it takes a lot of courage and a lot of vulnerability to look at ourselves and say, hey, I'm actually not getting this, right? How often in communication do we have the courage to say, sorry, I didn't understand what you just said? No, we just BS it and say, yeah, whatever. And then what she did was so brilliant. She stopped trying to play. The metaphor is she stopped trying to speak. And she said, let me just listen and get this. So she sat there for one whole run through the music and just listened. And then she picked up that drum and nailed it. And it was such a victory. It was so powerful. It was a really, really powerful moment. And I haven't forgotten it all these years later.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's the perfect metaphor. It's the perfect illustration for taking in the intelligence we need in order to make the appropriate adjustment on our end, whether that's speaking, whether that's communicating, whether that's playing drums, instead of forcing our way through it, faking it, quitting.
Yeah.
Instead, she found her own way to learn what she needed to learn.
Exactly. And as a leader, in any organization, we have to remember, okay, not everyone's going to learn at the same speed. They're not all going to learn it the same way. And I'm not the one who's always going to know all the answers. So part of being a leader is recognizing when we don't know the answers and being willing to turn to our teams to either provide us the answers or provide the support that we need as a unit to get through whatever the challenge in front of us is. And it takes a lot of courage and a lot of humility as a leader to say, hey, I don't know all the answers. I don't have the solution. Let's crowdsource this. Let's group source this, or at least let me just shut up and listen.
All true, but especially the last one. Let the answer come to me.
Yep.
especially if I'm frustrated, especially if I feel like I'm not getting it, especially if I feel like I'm stressed, the more I try to go force that answer, the more I'm probably making the situation worse.
Yes.
But if I can relax, if I can empty my brain, if I can take in what's going on around me and I let the answer come to me, I'm more likely to find it.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true. It's so true. It's like overthinking what we're going to say versus listening and speaking. I remember my teacher one time said, he said, okay, so there's a difference between the way Western people and African people learn to play music. He said, in the beginning, Western people, they think and then they play. He said, African musicians, we just play. we skip the thinking part. And I remember, this is several decades back in my learning of the technical side of the music. I remember that shift. It was, okay, thinking about what I'm supposed to play and how to play it, and then executing it a fraction of a second later, versus hearing, oh, this is where the music wants to go, and allowing the music to come out. That's a totally different thing, playing from listening versus thinking and then playing. That's a big shift. And I think the metaphor in communication is absolutely just as powerful in that context as it is in music.
I would agree. And I think even from an emotive standpoint, like music creates emotions. Emotions then drive actions. Communication creates emotions. Emotions then drive actions.
That's
So
it.
I don't know the first thing about playing music, although you've now very politely told me that's my own mental problem and I could probably learn if I practiced. So thank you for being polite and professional in how you convey that message. But if you as a musician want someone to feel a certain way, you can change the instrument, you can change the key, you can change the speed, you can change the notes, you can change the amount of instruments, you can change the volume, you can change all of these things to change the emotion, which then changes the action. And as communicators, we have as many, if not more, adjustments that we can make to try to do a better job intentionally creating a productive emotion in our audience, as opposed to intentionally or accidentally creating unproductive emotions.
You're hired. Come on stage with us, man. That is so true. Yeah, it's back to, it's not what we say, but it's how we say it. It's what's the context, the intention, the emotional impact. And what I love about music is we've done this in a room of 100 people. People are nervous, so they're trying to be really serious and trying to get it. And you can see their faces are very straight and stiff. And in the middle of the piece, I'll say, hey, smile. And people smile, and you can hear the difference in the music instantly. The music changes. It's the same notes, same tempo, everything, but the context, the emotional impact is entirely different. Oh, sorry. I was just going to add on just one other of a great story. One of my communication mentors, we were in the grocery store, and he was trying to explain to me, hey, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It's all about the context, the emotion. And in that moment, we got up to the front of the grocery line, and he said, I'll give you an example. And he said to the checkout clerk, he said, the content of what he said was, well, you're just as dumb as you look. But he said it in the context of a joke that in the context of that conversation, the emotion that he evoked from that checkout clerk was hilarity. They thought it was just so funny, they cracked up, and everyone had a great time in that moment. So yeah, it's the emotional impact. It's the content, the context, not the content.
Love it. And I love the bravery of telling a clerk you're as dumb as you look, but it's in the delivery. It's all in the delivery. I believe I know this to be true. I have no idea how it's true. How does music turbocharge learning? Like, how does it impact our brain and put us in a place where we're able to learn more and learn faster?
Oh, that's great. So there's a ton of neurological research out there about the impact of music on brain physiology. I'll just give you a couple of highlights that I think are really interesting. There's some research that came out about exposing children to music, and they found that exposing children to music has quite measurable impacts in neurology, the various parts of the brain. I won't get into it. It's kind of technical. People can read that for themselves who are listening to us now. But what they found is that the earlier that we expose children to music, the greater the impact through the course of their whole life. That makes a difference, that length and time of exposure. So there's that whole neurology side to the answer to your question, but just practically speaking, in a way that we use music, our job is to find out, hey, from our corporate clients, what do you want these participants to come away with? What are the learning objectives that you want them to leave this room with? And one of the things I love about my job is I almost think about it as like I'm a translator. So how do I translate the musical experience to those learning objectives? How do I create a musical experience that as we navigate it is going to pull out those learning objectives and bring that to the front of people's minds? And why I think music accelerates learning is because when you're playing music, you have to be mindful, you have to be present, and it's fun and engaging, right? So it's not another PowerPoint, it's not another talking head. You're not, taping your eyeballs, open to stay awake. So I think music turbocharges the learning process because of the state that it generates. So it generates a state of mindfulness. It generates a state of presence. And when we're in that receptive mode, learning happens more powerfully, faster, more naturally, and sticks longer. So I think you have both the physiological, the neurological side to it, and then I think you have the subjective mindfulness or state of awareness aspect to the way that music turbocharges learning.
I love that answer. I love it. Thank you. What have been some of the surprising things people have told you they've learned about themselves through music?
And I think the earliest, most impactful experience I can think of was I was teaching a private lesson to a married couple how to play. So it was the three of us. We did an hour-long lesson. And at the end, the guy said to me, wow, I can totally see that the way that we play music together, my wife and I, completely mirrors the way that we communicate in our marriage. And I was blown away. I mean, at that time, I was just teaching music to teach music, right? I wasn't doing any of this corporate work. I was, a professional musician playing in bands and just teaching lessons. And that really stunned me because, I mean, whoa, I really didn't even know what to say. Like, what? The way you play music mirrors the way that you communicate in your marriage? And I think that kind of points to the general answers that I get when I ask people, well, what has music taught you about yourself? I think music gives us a perspective on ourselves. It allows us to see ourselves through a new lens. It allows us to see ourselves in a perspective that we may not otherwise see ourselves. Like, for example, in our leadership development programs, we tell people, hey, we're not going to tell you anything about leadership that you don't already know. You wouldn't be where you are in this company unless you already knew something about leadership. So we're not going to tell you something you don't know. We're going to invite you to look at what you know and look at yourself through a new context, through a new lens. So in the same way that we have expert blind spots about the content that we might be an expert in, we also have our personal blind spots. We're the expert in being ourselves. You're the expert in being you. I'm the expert in being me. But in the musical context, we get a chance to see how we show up in a new way. And then we can learn, oh yeah, look, the way I responded in this musical environment has a lot of parallels to how I respond in my work environment, in my relationships, in communication. And so it becomes a process of self-discovery, of self-insight, because of that new perspective, the way we get to see ourselves show up in that musical environment.
I think that's a great way to look at it. I appreciate that. So you just offhand mentioned that you've played in bands.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you for any details on that. Well, your death metal history, you can keep it to yourself. But I have been to, like, for me, when I was younger, going to shows was like my thing. So been to all kinds of shows, different size venues, mostly smaller, but watching bands play. And when we talk about connecting with audiences, I feel like some bands and some band members do a better job connecting with audiences than others. And that doesn't mean that they're a bad musician or that they're bad at what they do, but some are just more attentive and do a better job at connecting with audiences. And in a reverse way, I feel like a lot of how I learned to connect with audiences, I learned from watching those bands when I was younger and taking notes of how, mental notes. I mean, I wasn't that kid with my glasses and a pad, but recognizing how they react to different audiences in different situations and how they handle it. And well, some bands would tell people what to do, but some are not really telling people what to do, but they're setting the tone so there's expectations and people know what to do. So I'm curious, from a leadership or communication standpoint, what lessons have you taken away from like a musical stage presence that can be applied to a business stage presence?
I think it comes down to listening. You know, when I look at the musicians with the most presence, with the most connection to their audience, it's because they're actually listening to the audience and responding back. You know, whether it's the choice of repertoire, whether it's the banter between songs, whether it's the way they make eye contact, they're actually listening. You know, you've in the course of this last hour, you've actually done it several times. There was a moment where we both started to speak, but you said, nope, stop, you go first, right? So as a musician on stage, I've had moments where I've been speaking and ready to go on to the next thing, but a handful of people start clapping. So I say, oh yeah, come on, round of applause, absolutely, let's go. And we get the whole house clapping. So it's that kind of connection. People want to be heard. At the end of the day, people want to be heard. And when you're an audience member and you see that the musicians on stage are hearing you, not just you hearing them, that makes a really powerful connection. And I think as leaders, as human beings, it's the exact same thing. When we feel heard, then we feel respected, then there's trust, then there's communication, then there's actual connection.
I love it. And it's making it that mutual experience. We have different roles to play, but we're all involved in this. This coin is spinning and one half doesn't exist without the other half. We have our own contributions to make this experience work.
Yes. And what I love about West African music particularly is it's very community based. So sure, you have the musicians who are playing the drums, but then you have the people in the community who are singing, the people in the community who are clapping their hands. You have the people who jump in and dance. It's very, very much participatory. Whereas, you know, kind of classic Western music is you have the orchestra on the stage, they do their thing, the audience sits there and listens. It's kind of a one-way street, but in West African music, it's super community, it's super interactive. It's very much a co-creation. And so as a musician, as a facilitator of the programs that we do, I don't think about it as us doing something for them, to them, communicating to them. We're creating an experience together. And it, like you said, it takes both sides of that coin. And I think as a leader, it's the same thing. You know, any leader can't create the result by themselves. They have to work together with their team. And it's not about either one, it's about what they can do together. So it's that whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. And any ensemble, any orchestra, any band, it's the same thing. It's the whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. When you put all the instruments together, what's that overall top level result?
Again, great illustration. And obviously for me, never having seen the West drumming experience that you have, the drummers don't play as well without the dancers, who don't dance as well without the drummers, who don't get the same amount of energy without the clappers, who don't get the same amount of energy without the dancers. So it's constantly this symbiotic relationship. Everybody's feeding off the other, and that's what creates this whole experience, which is true in any communication environment.
Period.
So I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I want to be very respectful of your time. I know when we were scheduling this, we were trying to wedge it in for you where it might fit. And I appreciate you making this conversation today work. So I guess we'll go out on this one. We've talked about a lot of different things from language to music and benefits and application, but what may be one surprising power or benefit from integrating music that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, I would say one thing that we haven't touched on yet is the physical health benefits of playing music. You know, we, like you said, we talked a lot about communication, leadership, all of that, but I think the health benefits of playing music and the amount of research that's out there is just huge. I know specifically for drumming, there's a group of doctors that did some research and they found that as it applies to stress and the immune system, so drumming actually reverses the hormonal cascade that results from the fight or flight response, or that is the physiological component of the fight or flight response. So it has the effect of calming the nervous system, reversing that cycle, and it also increases the activity of natural killer cells, which are the immune system cells that go through the body and fight disease, illness, that kind of thing. And I really love that. Health is a big area of focus for me in my personal life. I think health, exercise, it all goes together with leadership, with communication, with mindfulness, the whole nine yards. So we haven't talked about it. I mean, we could do a 2-hour podcast just on the health impacts of music, but I think that's a major one. That's a huge benefit out there. And we get a lot of requests to do programs with music specifically for stress reduction.
I think that's awesome. And not only, I mean, I don't have to see the research. Intuitively, that makes sense. I totally get it. You have the physical activity of drumming. So you have that physical pace that you're putting your body through, but then you also have the rhythm that goes with it. You have the sounds coming from it. That is going to change your biorhythms, how your brain is functioning, all of. So it's almost like a complete experience there. That makes total sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way you broke that down. Going back to the beginning of the conversation, we talked about music and communication as an acquired ability made of specific component sub-skills. The health benefits of music, playing music, that's how the researchers approach it. Well, what are the specific sub-elements, the composite elements that make this good for us? So, and there's all of those elements that you just broke out right there.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate that. But I think it's great. I mean, I've got a 6-year-old son. At this point, we're exposing him to a lot of things, and music is something he's into. Music, he enjoys listening to it. So trying to turn him on to learning some instruments is one of the next things we're trying to figure out how to balance. Maybe it takes, maybe it doesn't, but at least trying to give him that opportunity.
Exposure.
So, yeah. Let him choose. My job is to expose it, not ruin it. Let him choose.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
So hopefully people have been listening to this conversation thinking, damn, I didn't think about that. I didn't realize that. That's different. That's unique. That's awesome. So for people who are thinking, I want to learn more about Bill and Say What Beats, where do they need to go?
Our website is saywhatbeatsusa.com. SEWA, saywhatbeatsusa.com.
Awesome. And I know you're on LinkedIn, so they can find you there. I'm sure all your contact information would be on the website or on LinkedIn if they want to reach out. And I will be sure to include links to all of your online resources for everybody as well. And I have no doubt that there are videos that people can watch so they can see the drumming experiences that you create and get an idea of the power of those.
For sure. They're on our website and they're on YouTube. And I can't believe how fast this hour's gone. It has been.
Yeah, that flew by.
It really did. We honestly could go for 2 hours.
And you know what? At some point, I would love to, man. Down the road, I'd like to schedule another conversation so we can pick up on some of the things we didn't have time to dive into today and keep going, because this was an awesome conversation. You found so many ways to sneak cool stuff in as you were talking. So I'd love to keep this going another time when we can.
Thank you. My pleasure, Michael. Thanks a lot for having me.
Hey, thank you for being here, man. Stay safe. We'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill, thank you so much. What an amazing conversation. You took that in so many directions and added so much value. Thank you. The stories from the time you spent in Africa, hearing not just what you learned, but how much the people meant to you, and seeing the passion and how you bring it to all of your clients currently. Honestly, and I know we mentioned it, I could have kept that conversation going on for another hour. I can't wait to see you again and to continue the conversation. Thank you so much, not just for spending the time with us today, but for all you do for so many people. Thank you for the great work. And of course, thank you to everybody for staying and listening to the conversation. I really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. We'll likely have Bill on again down the road. So thank you all very much for being with us. Before we go, of course, we want to thank our sponsors on the way out. We have HumanTell. Please head over to humantell.com and enter the code Inquasive25 for 25% off all of their online training programs. I highly recommend it. It's all self-paced. As you go through it, you'll learn to recognize what people's faces and body language look like as their emotions change, what it likely means they're thinking and experiencing, and then how we can begin to apply it depending on the context of the situation we're in. I highly recommend it. That's over at humantell.com. International Association of Interviewers. Please head over to certifiedinterviewer.com and explore all of the options that they have there for in-person and online learning, networking, interviewing resources, and of course, the Certified Forensic Interviewer designation. That's over at certifiedinterviewer.com. And Inquasive, where you can learn over at inquasive.com the programs that organizations ask us to facilitate for them, for their leadership teams, their sales teams, and their HR teams, to teach them to maximize the value of their observations and apply strategic and ethical observation and persuasion techniques. That's over at inquasive.com. And if you've enjoyed this conversation and you're looking to learn more about the disciplined listening method, you can pick up the book, The Disciplined Listening Method, and get all the research, stories, examples, and applications at Amazon and Barnes and Noble. We very much appreciate you spending the time with us. Please take a few extra seconds, like the show, share the show, subscribe to the show, comment on the show, and share your feedback with us. We would love to hear your thoughts. What would you like to hear more or less of? What would you like to see or hear a little bit different? If you have some people that you'd love to see on the show, please let us know. We'll reach out and we'll see if we can make it happen for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch or listen today. We truly appreciate it. Please stay safe, take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.